So let me go ahead and turn it over to the author team. Thank you all so much for being with us here today. This is a wonderful article, and we look forward to learning more about how you've approached the topic and how we can web scrape for insights. So thank you so much.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Christine, for the introduction and the opportunity to talk more about our work on scraping web data for marketing insights. I'm really excited and delighted that so many of you are here today, and a warm welcome on behalf of the entire team to this webinar. And the goal that we have for today is to really unpack how web data can advance marketing research. We will discuss how it has been and can be collected, and also really illustrate the pathways through which it can inform marketing knowledge and advance what we know about consumers and markets in general. The heart of our webinar and the time we are going to spend together today is going to be on the new methodological framework, which we introduce in our forthcoming Journal of Marketing article, that really seeks to empower you, the researchers, to maximize the validity of the web data sets that you collect by carefully navigating the idiosyncratic legal and technical issues that are often involved in collecting web data. And we will discuss that across the key 3 stages in collecting web data, that is selecting the source, designing the collection, and then the extraction of the data itself. We will conclude the presentation part of this webinar by providing some food for thought. And then, as Christine alluded to, we have reserved some extra time towards the end for more questions and answers. And please feel free to ask questions in the Q&A as we move along. So let's get right to web data in academic marketing research. It probably is no surprise to any of you that the web and web-based services are really essential for social and commercial life in the 21st century. Just consider this one statistic. The average American consumer in 2022 spends more than 7 hours every single day online. At the same time, many companies across numerous industries are heavily relying on digital channels and the web to serve customers. Thus, it is no surprise that there's this enormous wealth of very diverse data out there, potentially for research. If you visited TripAdvisor today, you would find on that website alone more than 1 billion reviews and opinions. It is because of this easily accessible data that is diverse and incredibly rich that web data has been used increasingly over the last 2 decades in all of the top 5 marketing journals. As you can see in this chart from our article, this holds true both in terms of the absolute number of publications that use some form of web data, as well as their relative share among all publications in marketing. So assume you're interested in using web data for one of your research projects. How can you go about this? Well, let's assume you want to collect some data from Amazon. For instance, you want to collect the review rating, the star rating, as well as the review text for all headphones on Amazon. One thing you could do is simply manually copy and paste all the data from the different pages. You can do that, but doing so is very laborious. It's time intensive, and it's also prone to errors and not very scalable. So instead, what you would likely do is you would use web scraping, which is the process of developing software that automatically collects information displayed in a web browser. Importantly, web scraping is not the only way through which you can extract web data at scale. Some websites, Amazon, at least when it comes to review data, is not one of them, offer programmatic access to their databases or algorithms. So for example, if you're interested in gathering data from Twitter, you could use their API to extract tweets as well as the social networks of users. Regardless about regardless of the particular pathway you choose to gather data. So whether that is web scraping, a combination of web scraping and APIs, or even manual extraction, web data by themselves have been really an essential ingredient to advancing marketing knowledge over the last 2 decades. And in our review of more than 300 published articles using web data, we have identified 4 key pathways through which web data has contributed to marketing knowledge. First of all, it really empowers researchers to study new emerging phenomena. Think, for instance, about the impact of the sharing economy, Airbnb, on incumbent in those markets, let's say hotels. Secondly, web data really empowers researchers to boost the ecological validity of the work that they engage in by studying outcome variables such as sales ranks or actual online search data from Google that is of high relevance to managers. Given that web data is often large in scale and typically involves idiosyncratic consideration, it has also really spurred methodological advancement over the last 2 decades. For instance, how can we as researchers, as well as managers, make sense of the large amounts of unstructured textual or visual data to derive, for instance, consumer insights, or to better understand how our brands are positioned in the marketplace? And lastly, again, a little bit more focused on the researcher side, web data is really powerful in improving the measurement in some of the models we're trying to estimate, for instance, allowing us to better operationalize control variables. Do note that the webinar today is focusing a lot on academic audiences, but web scraping and APIs, of course, are also fundamental to the business models of some of the leading corporations out there. And they can be a crucial input to generate novel insights, for instance, about developing new products, as well as consumer sentiment. So now that I've given you this high fever pitch about why web data is great, it is important to recognize that collecting web data for academic as well as managerial research can often be challenging. One of the key reasons among many for this is that the data generation process in web data is often opaque. Web data is typically created in a highly dynamic environment and often features measures that are either poorly or not documented at all. Unfortunately, for you as a researcher, there's not this single click to download button, but rather you need to generate the data set via automated browsing. The combination of these and other factors creates a number of idiosyncratic pitfalls that can undermine the validity of web data sets, and more on that later. Assume you now embark after this webinar today on a research project that uses web data. You will be faced with a large number of small and large-scale decisions in your project. For instance, should you gather data from a single source or multiple sources? Are there any algorithms at play on your sources that could interfere with the way the information is displayed? Should you keep any of the raw web data, for instance, the HTML code that you use to generate your subsequent data set? When we embarked on our article that eventually is going to be published in the Journal of Marketing later this year, we quickly realized that the existing guidance on questions like these is somewhat limited. There are a lot of wonderful technical tutorials out there that will help you to understand the technicalities of extracting web data at scale via web scraping or APIs, but they are typically not discussing validity concerns. These works are also often not addressing how to best mitigate or even completely reduce the legal concerns that can be triggered by collecting web data. We would be remiss not to note some of the excellent methodological articles out there that focus on web data in certain parts of the process of collecting web data. However, none of these really cover the entire process of collecting web data, from source selection to designing the data collection to the extraction itself. I see that there's a question. The slide deck will be shared also after the presentation. So to quickly synthesize these concerns, they really motivated us to come up with a new framework that helps researchers to maximize validity while carefully navigating legal and technical challenges. And at the heart of our framework is the recognition that validity can only be achieved if you simultaneously consider technical feasibility, as well as ways to effectively handle legal and ethical issues. And you need to do that across all stages of collecting web data. And I would like to begin by talking about source selection briefly. So why is this potentially challenging? If any of you spend any time online, you will realize that very frequently we can draw from an almost unlimited number of sources for our data sets. However, these sources vary vastly in terms of their quality, their stability, how easy it is to retrieve data to them. Also, how can we access them? Is it only via web scraping, or do we have an API? And what we have found in our review, as well as our own personal experience as researchers, that we might sometimes be tempted to default or primarily consider dominant or familiar platforms. However, we really would encourage researchers to explore the universe of potential web sources broadly. You can do so, for instance, by broadening the geographic search criteria. Think about non-Western website. Think about non-US website. You can identify adjacent data sources, for instance, using Google Trends related search queries. And also consider not just primary data providers such as YouTube or Twitter, but also data aggregators such as SocialBlade. To give you a more specific example, imagine I was interested as a researcher in studying the effect of particular product features or particular situations on the star ratings and the review text that I write. Some of the most frequently used sources in marketing are Amazon, TripAdvisor, and Yelp. I could go to any of those. However, there are also many other websites out there, such as Skytrax, which offer airline industry reviews, or maybe Healthgrade. And depending on my research question, maybe some of these platforms have even better characteristics, maybe better set of covariates, or easier retrievability. And lastly, I could also reach out to non-English speaking sources. For instance, I could gather data from bol.com, the leading Dutch e-commerce player. Importantly, I said that you can get web data through web scraping or API, but it's important to recognize that there are also amazing data sets out there based on web data that were either scraped by others, such as Julian McAuley at USCD, or provided by companies, the Yelp dataset, or on platforms such as Kaggle. The third and important step in source selection beyond broadly exploring the universe, considering alternatives to web scraping, is to fully map the data context. And what we mean by this is you want to understand the context that you are engaging in for your research projects. So you could, for instance, screen blogs, screen press releases, really unpack whether there were any significant changes to the data generating process. For instance, using archive.org. Johannes will talk about this more later. And at that point, you really want to start exploring whether algorithms are present at your website that somehow interfere with the goal of your research. For instance, many websites like Amazon will personalize the website that you see based on your browsing behavior. And you need to, even at the source selection stage, need to have an idea for whether such algorithmic interference is likely. At this moment, this is the first break where we can take some questions, and I'm just gonna see whether there are any questions right now. And if not, I would hand it over to Johannes.
Let me go ahead if I might. I
Yeah,
had
sure.
one question for you guys. So one issue that you pointed to at the very beginning, but that we didn't get a chance to talk about yet, was how does the researcher decide to build a single source or multi-source data set? How should they think that through?
Yeah, that's a great question. What Christine is alluding to in marketing, if we're interested in testing particular hypothesis, sometimes we might focus, let's say, on Amazon data only. But if I, as a researcher, am interested in generating more generalizable claim, it might be really good to collect data from multiple sources. So not just Amazon, but maybe also Twitter data, maybe also TripAdvisor data. So this always interacts with the researcher's objective. And on the other hand, there are other research projects for which, by definition, the particular research question requires the integration of different sources. So let's say websites as well as non-website or APIs and non-web data sources to effectively address the research question.
And just a reminder to everybody that you can type any questions that you have into the Q&A tab that's in Zoom. But one other, I guess, you talk about in the paper, and we had a ongoing discussion about this in the review process about, kind of the default, which is towards Amazon and Yelp and, some of these more standard sources. What are some of your tips or secrets, if you will, for, really understanding what those, good options are out there? Because I would imagine that there's that really could add a lot of value if people can come up with a very nice source that's unique.
Yeah, so unfortunately, there's not this one secret recipe, but there are a lot of different steps you can take. So for instance, one thing that I always try to do if I try to embark on a new research question with which I'm unfamiliar is to actually try to find people in my social circles and beyond that are actually consumers in that space. So what kind of websites, what kind of services do they use? I like to read a lot outside marketing too. So for instance, in our general discussion, we discussed some papers from sociology that have used different sources from those that we have used. So really being very open-minded, both in whom you talk to or simply browsing the Reddit forums of people that are interested in a question can really help us as researchers to move beyond the defaults. And by the way, just to make this clear, sometimes the default can actually be the best source. It's not by no means a statement that you should never go to the defaults. They are defaults for a reason.
Yeah, they're good choices. So
yeah,
there are some questions that have come in.
I think I would like to take one of those questions.
Yeah.
So the question is, how do you account for algorithmic biases, for example, when extracting Twitter data? So I think two recommendations I would make here is to try to collect extra metadata on the platform. So not only the target metrics, but also maybe the drivers of that recommendation engine. If there's some theory of which, you can expect that, Twitter to employ certain algorithms. And afterwards in your econometric model, that could offer opportunities to actually mimicking that system and controlling for a potential impact if you can't really observe that full engine. Another thing that is really particularly useful is to keep an eye on let's say, the tech updates that firms post. So for example, I conduct a lot of research on music and movie streaming, and Spotify, a major music streaming platform, has a blog. And whenever they tweak algorithms or introduce a new recommendation system, they post about it. So that offers you opportunities to do a kind of pre-post analysis on whether anything in your main effects may have changed pre versus post the introduction of changes to that algorithm. And probably the literature is also quite rich on that. So other studies run into these same problems. So looking at good approaches in the literature is also another strategy that you could follow. These are just a few thoughts about it.
Oh, that's great. Shilpi, I'm wondering if you guys, if you could clarify your question. It's about using identifying sources through keywords, or if there's I wasn't sure exactly how to interpret the question. If you guys had a thought on what he or she might mean, if not, we can wait and have her or him post back to us again.
Maybe I can address that. I think what Shilpi is asking for, I think, pertains to Johannes's question on Google search queries, I think. And she was asking if you want to figure out in a particular research question and you're looking at Amazon books and, we can type in Amazon books or something like that, depending upon the research question on Google. And then what Google Trends does is it gives you the related search words. And perhaps, you can get an idea about different brands or different, entities, which your research question will pertain to, will be helpful for you.
Excellent. And then I think Samid's question about the authenticity of the data, I guess this goes a little bit to validity, and maybe this is something that you guys will come to later. Would you like to address that now or wait?
I think I would like to give a little remark. I think what is really important is that you make an initial evaluation of that when you browse the website, right? So sometimes you feel like the website is responding very slowly, and then you're trying to identify who actually put that website online and you can't find it. Maybe you can use archive.org to see how long the site has been up, how many times is this being indexed. You can look up its search rank. So, try to get an idea about who is running that website and how stable it is. I think the validity issue, that will be something that you eventually touch upon later when you do many of those checks that we propose in the paper. But I think you yourself need to, if there's like a slight feeling of discomfort, try to go after it and find a reason and try to gather some extra data to validate that. So that would be my advice.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
And maybe just to add quickly to that, trust your intuition there also. Like if you think something doesn't check out immediately, it's better to invest that extra scrutiny up front rather than to collect all the data and then afterwards kind of run into the same issues. We are speaking from experiences, some of them very scornful for all of us.
So Zheng Ho asks about the implications of web data and scraping of web data for reproducibility and replicability. I think that's related a little bit to the issue of the reliability and validity. So I'll leave that to you guys. Do you want to address that now, or do you want to wait until the next segment? Because I know we're just here at the beginning in terms of source selection. So I'll leave that to
I need to say I totally agree with your statement. And I think as a community, we need to develop some thoughts of how to do this. And maybe some of those decision parameters that we have in our paper could be drivers of, such a maybe meta-analysis on an important marketing question. And then we tackle that with a couple of teams and see what are those parameters that drive these effects. I think we could do that in line with what we see in psychology, right? And for web data, that would be very unique.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And I think for all of you writing questions about this topic, this is something that the authors do deal with, some of the ethical and legal questions that are part of this. So why don't we move on and we'll circle back to pick up a few of these questions that I think you're going to touch on later in more depth. But keep the questions coming, everyone.
Thank you. I will take over from here. So recall that there is no single download button to get your data, right? So you have to instruct the computer software to get the data. And in doing so, you need to carefully think through a particular set of design questions. And it is good if you start doing this upfront before you actually, program up your scraper or API collection, because it has a lot of ramifications for the validity of your data. So let me return to the example that Johannes just introduced, right? So imagine you want to collect data on headphones because you're interested in assessing the impact of consumer reviews on, let's say, sales, right? Something that not in that category, but has been done quite a number of times. So in this case, I have marked the valence score, 4.5 out of 5 stars, and also the volume, which is like 1,215 ratings here, right? When you scroll through a website, try to see what other information is there, right? So for example, there's also information on product attributes, which we may or may not use later on in our analysis. You can also view pictures. And I think it is important here at this stage not to just go with the default variables. Let's say, oh, I want to regress sales on valence and volume, but think a little more broadly about what else could be done with the data. Images is something that is becoming more and more, bigger and bigger in marketing. And alongside with this collection, it is not hard to also capture these images and run some, simple image analysis and thereby incorporate the data, right? So in choosing which information to extract, adopt a very broad, future-oriented mindset, because many of those measures that you will end up collecting may prove very, very useful. Also, try to assess on what pages information is and how that information differs from information on other pages. So recall the valence, 4.5 out of 5 stars, and the volume was available at the product page at Amazon.com, but the distribution of reviews was not. When you click a little through and go to the consumer review section, you see actually that, slight derivations of that same data will be shown to you. And of course, also new measures keep on popping up as you browse a website. So just don't stop with the first page that you encounter because it has some of the information, but try to click through to really discover the wealth of information available on a website. You may even end up at the consumer profile pages of reviewers, probably a page that many of you may not have seen yet. If you click on the usernames of reviewers, you get there. And that may allow you to collect extra demographic variables that, may not even be, part of your story in the first place, but that may come in handy later on. In deciding which information to extract, it is of essential importance to keep an eye on the validity implications as well as legal and ethical risks and the technical feasibility of your study and of collecting that data. And I'll walk you through some of those challenges right now and provide some tips on how you could tackle them. So as a first validity challenge is really assessing whether there are any algorithmic biases or missing data that could potentially invalidate your findings later on. And some good initial idea on whether there are algorithms active on the pages: simply delete your cookies and check whether the site changes. Open it up on multiple devices. Have your co-authors open up websites at different moments of the day and try to see which sections are the same and which sections are different. I have recently done this with promotional data for playlists at Spotify, and I asked colleagues to open that same page in different countries to kind of ensure that what I think I see is actually what I get. And thereby I could kind of confirm my assumptions about that data. Sometimes it is also important to assess whether there are any changes in the data generating process, right? So if you visit Amazon.com today, and you see reviews posted in, let's say, 2018, these reviews were posted on a different kind of looking website. It was still Amazon.com, but different features were in place. Different categories were in place at the store at that point in time. And using archive.org is one way through which you can look back at historical versions of popular websites to kind of see whether any major changes to the data generating processes have appeared. Also, some web data requires you to collect extra metadata to make sense of this. As a simple example, when you download charts from spotifycharts.com, it doesn't come with a timestamp. So when you actually download this data and try to structure it, you need to augment it with timestamps. But there are many different ways through which you can augment data, such as IP addresses, for example. Suppose you're interested in analyzing Netflix recommendations across the globe and you set up a scraping infrastructure across different territories. Then you could also capture your IP address location to be later on linking it to the proper geographic location. Of course, there are legal and ethical risks in scraping, and we all know these are present. So try to assess whether information that you want to get is available publicly without logging in, or is hidden behind a login wall for which you have to create a user ID. Most of the times when you log in, you explicitly consent to the terms of use of a service, which may inhibit the use of that data. What I recently discovered is some of those pages that seemingly are hidden behind some user login actually are still publicly available once you have that link. So that may be a strategy for you too, to apply, to browse publicly available websites. You're always safer when you do that. And it could also even be a good argument of why you use one website over another. Also, you need to pay attention to whether you gather any personal or sensitive information. Even usernames that may seem nonsense to you may potentially allow you to identify actual usernames, particularly if it allows you to merge it with other data sets. Good practice is to anonymize such personal information or sensitive information on the fly. So while you're collecting it, this is technically advanced and you really need to make sure it works well and test it very well. But that could safeguard you against many of those problems. Another thing is you need to be mindful about the reason that users or firms use particular services that then enter your scraping, right? If there is no overlap in the original intent and the way you use it, it may be problematic. So the way you can assess this is try to formulate a scientific justification for using the data. A few years ago, that has been very, very useful to me when a firm approached me about the use of web data, and providing a sound scientific justification actually made the firm agree with the use of that data for academic research. In terms of the technical feasibility, as you're prototyping your collection, try to see whether all information that you want to get is actually extractable. And sometimes you just need to swap technologies and try something else to get that information. So building a prototype really is a key thing that you need to do. Sometimes you also have limits to iterating through pages. Remember, we want to do this at scale. We just don't want to capture review data for one product, but for thousands of products. So you have to iterate through all of those products. And some firms, they have walls against scraping, and they have limits. So for example, the search results at Amazon are kept, I think, at about 400 products, if I'm not mistaken. But in any ways, they're capped. So you need to be mindful about that limit as you decide which information to extract from which pages. Some tips are, check the maximum number of pages you can get. Try a few in between and see whether eventually the firm has, tries to block these requests or not. A second decision space where you have to make careful decisions is about sampling. Recall, there's no download button. You don't have access to the entire population of a website of which you want to engage in the scraping project. So how can you capture a population or a sample of this? A good advice is to look for so-called seeds, seeding users or seeding products on the site itself. For example, Amazon.com has bestseller lists for various product categories. They have category overview pages that allow you to flip through the catalog of pages. And they also have a search functionality. For example, recently I wanted to sample randomly from the user base of a digital media service. And what we did is we made search queries in the search box with every letter of the alphabet, and then captured the search results, which were usernames that stored it with that letter. And that way we kind of build an understanding, or let's say we build our sample of random users. In other circumstances, it may be a good idea to use externally available lists. So for example, in one of the first scraping papers in marketing, these bestseller lists in New York Times were used to build a representative sample of best-selling books that were then matched to the web data. Be mindful that any kind of sampling frame that you are thinking about creates different data sets or could even introduce systematic biases. So it makes sense thinking about this very, very carefully, and also spend a lot of time trying out different sample schemes. And finally, be mindful about that not each sample size can actually be retrieved. So for example, in web scraping, if you adhere to visiting one page every second, there's an upper boundary to the number of pages that you can visit a day, about 86,000. And this parameter varies because sometimes the pages can't be loaded that quick. So really spend some time assessing this as you motivate your sample size. And in our paper, we have some more thoughts about how you do this and a formula that you can use to defend your sample size choices. A third decision space when it comes to designing your data collection pertains to the frequency through which you extract data. And there are numerous challenges, right? And I think the most important takeaway here is that you need to validate your data assumptions early on. So an easy assumption that most of us probably get started is, so we look through the review data and we think, well, that data looks pretty historical, right? I mean, we can go through the entire archive of reviews when we see products at Amazon.com. But is that actually true? Well, there are some papers who have questioned this and actually found out that, after time, Amazon.com deletes some of those reviews. And you as a consumer, as a researcher, you can't see that at that point in time. So suppose you want to study fake reviews at a review platform. It makes sense capturing that what looks historical data multiple times, let's say for a duration of a couple of months. And as reviews disappear, you may have identified fake reviews and could use that in an extra analysis. Other things that warrant longitudinal data extractions may, for example, also relate if you want to estimate effects with more power, for example. And something crucially important in that sense is also that any changes to the extraction frequency also has implications on the kind of sample size that you want. So suppose I can get 86,000 products at Amazon adhering to a request once per second, but maybe the information that I want to capture is available on 2 pages. So the product page and the review page. So the limit is drastically halved, right? So, and you need to be mindful of this as you scrape your data. So for example, in one of my papers, we had an upper sample size of 5,000 users that we followed on a music recommendations groups. And before I started out, I thought I would end up with a much higher sample, but that was kind of what that extraction limit gave us in combination with the extraction frequency. A final and fourth decision that you need to think about is how to process your data during the extraction. So web data is very messy, right? And those people that start out, they try to get a very, very clean data set out of their web scraping, where weird characters are striped off and all columns are nicely formatted. But actually, that may not be an optimal strategy as you design your data collection, because much of on-the-fly processing breaks as you run your scraper multiple times. For example, just because the websites get an update and the source code of the website changes. Keeping the raw data whenever possible is a good strategy to safeguard you against these threats to validity. And it also offers exciting opportunities for conducting research, because you may stumble into natural experiments. So for example, a while ago, the not helpful button at Amazon.com disappeared. And also YouTube recently launched an update to their dislikes feature at the platform. Well, if you're capturing all of that information, it gives you extra variation through which you can conduct exciting analysis. The third stage in our methodological framework is about extracting the data, right? So recall, we have selected sources, potentially multiple sources, and for each of those sources, we have decided about a particular data collection strategy. Could be that this collection design is completely different for multiple sources, right? So it's very idiosyncratic. Now we're trying to take our prototypes and try to scale them up. So a few thoughts about scaling up your data collections. First of all, figure out the extent to which you need to improve the performance of the data collection. If you're engaging in longitudinal data collections, have them run for a few weeks and see whether they continue to work. It is also good if you log each of those URL requests that you're making and visualize the performance over extended periods, which gives you an idea about how well your data collection runs. Also, you need to monitor the content during the extraction. So although I tend to keep all of the raw data, I always parse, so that means extracting a minimal amount of information from the website on the fly, which provides me of like a diagnostic data set. So in a recent project, I'm getting data in from a movie service, and I'm interested in the countries of my users, because that informs me about what extra metadata I have to collect. So we parse on the fly the country affiliation of users and have summary statistics. And, once a week or so, we look at this data, especially at the beginning of this data collection, and see what kind of countries end up in our data set. And that informed the subsequent step of deciding what extra metadata to get for particular countries. It also provides you an opportunity to jump in when your data collection breaks, because I promise you it will. And you don't want that collection to be down for a long time, because that could invalidate your research. And then finally, our advice is to start documenting your data set early on in the process. Nobody except you really knows how that data was generated. Many of, maybe even your co-authors are not mindful even about the fact and all of those decisions that you went through in generating this data set. So for everyone, it's good advice to start documenting this early, have kind of a logbook where you're noting particular issues that arose, and collect information around the focal source, take screenshots that may later be used in the paper. Sometimes websites go down and you don't have a screenshot. That happens. We have a bunch of tips in the paper about this, and also a link to a very good README template that you can use to kind of get going with your documentation, because we all know, like, we're probably not so much in love with documenting it, but it is really, really important that you do. So that somewhat wraps up our framework. We have walked you through 3 steps of source selection, collection design, and data extraction. And for each of those steps, we have raised a number of questions that you kind of need to answer before embarking on this project, or where you at least need to get refinement throughout that process, all with the goal of maximizing your validity while balancing the technical feasibility of your collection and mitigating any legal and ethical risks. In the paper, we have a bunch of tables that help you reason through these design challenges. So take a close look at them, and as you design your data collection, use them like a cheat sheet that guides your work and helps you also to defend particular choices that you're making in the paper. So we all know that those trade-offs are almost inevitable. So it would help the field if you make them explicit in the manuscript, and we hope that our paper helps you to see and recognize these issues, and also acknowledge them and teach the field how you tackle them. So I think with this, I feel like I want to take more questions. So maybe this is a good opportunity to pause for a while.
Wonderful. Thank you, Johannes. Thank you all. And yes, we have a lot of really great questions. I will just quickly make a note on 2 of them. So Tarun asked about web scraping policy. The AMA, I have seen a draft, although I just checked and I don't see it published anywhere. There is a draft of a web scraping policy that the AMA has put out that applies across the AMA journals, JM, JMR, JIM, and now a Journal of Public Policy and Marketing, and this new Journal of Interactive Marketing. That I don't see it published, but it's essentially the same, which is that if there are guidelines that have been posted by a company, that you need to certify that you've in fact followed those. And I will see if we can find a little bit more information about that we might post next to the article, the author's article. The other thing is that this video and the slides will be made available in the article. We'll post a link to the article in just a few minutes, so that you can actually grab the article and see all of the guidelines that the authors have put forth. So do you guys want to let me know which of the questions you would like to address? I see many. I think one question here that Jonathan asks is how much data is too much data to scrape? How do you sort of know when you've done enough?
Who wants to take it?
I think I can go. I mean, it all depends upon your research question. I mean, sometimes it depends upon the research context and the question. And I mean, you can collect as much data as you want, but I mean, I always tell people that data is available everywhere nowadays, and it just depends upon the research question and what effect are you looking at. Maybe a small sample is enough. It just depends upon the research question. The other way around, rather than thinking about how big the data that we need, it's what's your problem and what are you trying to solve. And you may even need a simple survey. It's enough. It depends upon the research question.
and to
Sorry
make
for a very bland answer.
No, it's good.
No, but to add to Abhi's point, I think he makes a very important point that web data does not per se imply big data. Some of the most powerful web data sets are not necessarily big data sets. Some of them are, but that's by no means the only way through which web data can really advance our field. For instance, you might also use web data to generate stimuli for experiments. And there you probably just look at 80 or 90 stimuli. And that would already be a large set of stimuli for any consumer research experiment. Back to you, Christine.
Yeah, I might also add, sorry, Kristen. I mean, it depends upon, where is this web data being situated in your paper? Is it for a pilot study, or is it the main research question in the paper, which is pivotal for the paper? So if it's just a pilot study that you're running and you're an experimentalist and you want to check some behavior on the, if it's externally valid, you just collect a sample of reviews and show it that this exists. And if it's for a major study, then, you need to think a bit more about, okay, what kind of data you're looking for.
That's a great answer. Can we come back to the question about reproducibility and replicability? Do you guys want to say more about that? Because it seems like that is on the minds of a lot of people these days. So
perfect. Let me maybe begin tackling it, and then I'm going to pass it on to the other two. One of the key points that we make, especially in our discussion of the actual data extraction, is the importance of documentation. Hannes said this correctly. It's maybe not the most exciting aspect of collecting web data, but at the same point, it is where you're going to thank your future self the most for doing it properly early on. And not just your future self, but your co-authors and the entire field. There's nothing better than having an amazing web data set that is well documented, that ideally is so rich that it can be used to answer many different research questions. And at the same point, one thing that I do when I review papers, and I have the feeling that maybe there were too many forking paths to get to a particular outcome. So I'm a consumer researcher. There are many existing data sets out there. If there's a concern about generalizability and the effect is should be sufficiently generalizable, they are pre-existing. For instance, the Yelp data set. You could prove that the same effect occurs there in a reasonable sample, and I would be perfectly content with that as a reviewer. And at the same point, we must recognize that the web is so highly dynamic, and there's some data set that you can only build once. But especially because of that, documentation is so critical that at least it's possible to kind of understand the steps that researchers took to get to that final data set.
I also see a couple of other questions here. So we will share later a website where we try to provide tools on how to get started with web scraping, links to API directories. So all those questions pertaining to this are hopefully answered. If not, you can shoot us an email and we're happy to add more resources. We also have some technical questions about, like, what can I scrape? And can I still scrape when the websites are dynamic, for example, right? If there's a lot of like clicks that you have to make and maybe hover over with your mouse, the simple answer is yes, you can. You just have to use different technologies to do this. Selenium and Python is one way that I prefer, but there are many languages that provide similar features that allow you to do. I always say, like, what you see is what you can get. So you could go by that rule of thumb.
And sometimes getting what you see is much harder than for other sites. And in turn, if you want to be efficient as a researcher, that can sometimes also be a very pragmatic decision criterion for you to decide between sources that are otherwise identical.
And Paola has a fascinating question. It's about languages, multiple languages, reviews, and it is suggested that these reviews could be translated before running a text analysis on them. I think the major point that I want to make here is you need to be creative when working with web data, because it is not perfect, right? And I just want to encourage you to find good solutions And, sometimes just go with your feeling and maybe translating into English, then run your analysis, maybe exclude that sample from your regression and include it and see whether the effects change, right? Like simple robustness checks that may already be enough to get that, solved. But the major point here I want to make is I also deal with issues that are just unsolved because the data is relatively novel, right? And because maybe some of those problems haven't been documented in the past. So by all means, like keep on doing what you do, even if it doesn't seem 100% solid compared to a commercial data set that you would get with properly translated things, but just mix and mingle these things. And I think it's going to lead to good insights.
Do you guys know, Enchi has a question about data protection from checking IP addresses. Is that I don't know with GDPR, if that's part of data protection, or what are your thoughts about that?
My thoughts are about like, it adds more information to identify persons. So yes, this is information that would fall under this. But you could decide before you actually get that data, what kind of level you need, right? If you get just the country information, that may be enough for your study and not add so much enrichment, right? If you go down to the zip level, that would be questionable, right? So think ahead before you get that data, what you want to store of that information.
Great, and I see some other questions coming in. I want to just make note that we posted the links both to the scholarly insight, which is the more lay version of the article, and then the actual article. Those are all in the chat that you could go and grab that. One thing that the authors did in the paper, which is a wonderful contribution to the field, is they identify a lot of really great future research opportunities using web data. We asked them to think about that and lay out some opportunities. Do you guys want to take a minute to just describe, I mean, no specific article, but maybe sort of how you approach that to entice people to look at that part of the article?
Sure, absolutely. Can I maybe even take over the presentation again, kind of answer your question in that way? Mm-hmm. Because one of the things that accompanies our forthcoming article is the companion website, which is called web-scraping.org, on which you can find actually database of all these published articles using web data in marketing. And what was really useful for us in doing this review exercise is it allowed us to identify some of the key avenues of things that we maybe as a field do not do really enough of. For instance, you can use APIs to run field experiments, but there are less than 5 papers in marketing that do that. We could actually build super unique data sets that draw on, let's say, more than 50 or 100 different sources to construct something that really does not exist yet. And we truly hope that in combination with the companion website, our future research section puts some of those ideally in the minds of some of you and is an inspiration. One of the key ways that we view our work, the framework, but also the entire article in terms of its usefulness is not just for research, but also for teaching. And all of us, we teach this both in content PhD seminars, for instance, in my own consumer behaviors, a section that I teach at Erasmus. I have an entire session on exploring marketplaces, people, perception, and morality with web data. Johannes, for instance, teaches several method courses, also integrating our work at different levels, such as the master level. And we really hope that the webinar combined with the article and the companion website are an inspiration for those of you who want to get started. A word of caution, the learning curve can be steep, so ideally try to find a buddy with whom you are going to master that curve. And do note that some of the web data is readily out there in databases, whether that's on Kaggle or Julian McAuley's website. If you are already working with web data, we hope that our framework can help you really reason through some of these really intricate design challenges. And we also hope to inspire you to envision new data sets that are not readily visible. So maybe where you extract data repeatedly from many websites over time. And lastly, if you're already an expert in working with web data, really embrace the value of this data and communicate it to the field, and the value also of web data sets in really advancing marketing thought and empowering us to be at the forefront of some of the key development in business. And also, you maybe will find our methodological framework useful in deciding which particular parts of the research process to outsource, let's say, to an RA, and over which parts of the research process you need to take control back. In sum, this webinar is a primer on web data in marketing. I think it's fair to say that web data is here to stay and likely to only grow. And regardless of what your particular focus is, methodologically or substantively, web data can really play a significant role in helping us collectively as scholars advance marketing knowledge. And to return to the title of our paper, as well as the presentation, there are many unexploited fields of gold there. And probably there was never more space for innovation and further growth from this. On that note, I'm not sure how we're really doing for time, but we would be more than happy to take additional questions. And then I'm going to pass back to you, Christine.
Thank you, Johannes. I think we are actually out of time, and your teammates are answering the final questions online as you were taking us through that final part. So this is, as I had hoped, inspiring, instructive, just terrific. I think this is a wonderful article. I hope all of you will read this and connect with the authors via the website that they provided. I will just go ahead and formally thank them and close the webinar with a final few set of slides, if we could go forward then. So thank you guys very much. And if you're interested in any of the articles that we publish at the Journal of Marketing, you can find the current issue as well as all other articles in advance or recently accepted articles as noted there on our website.